I'd like to pray with you before I dive in and talk about our issue this evening. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for each person that's here. It feels really good to be back at this church and some very familiar faces and friends. And then a lot of people that I don't know, especially the youth, the teens, young adults that are here. I just pray that you would bless each person. Lord, I don't know the backstories to most of the people in this room, but I do know that you bring together people for a reason, and I pray that tonight that you would just do a really amazing thing, and that you would just save somebody or encourage somebody, convict somebody, challenge them. And I pray that you would use me, even if I'm flawed and broken and have so many things that I don't know. I pray, Lord, that you would use this evening to bless, encourage, and challenge people in Jesus' name. Amen. So I'm really happy to be here tonight. Just a first confession, the thing that's easiest to say is talking to high school kids is way easier for me than speaking to the adults. I kind of wish, I'm going to pretend like I don't know you guys are out there. I see a hand, but I can't even see the adults. And the reason why I say that is because when you hang out with adults and you talk about sexual ethics, especially homosexuality, people can get very passionate and political. Kids can too, but you get much more hardened in your opinions typically when you get older. And so we tend to fight a lot about this stuff, even as Christian adults. And I know that when I talk to kids, I don't tend to fight. I tend to want to just learn, like, what do they know and what do they think and how they deal with it. And I think where you guys are at as high school kids is going to be totally different than people in my generation and even the young adults, like the college age, and the people who are your parents. So anyway, having said all that, let me move that over. I want to focus for a little while on a passage that really changed my life. It helped me a lot, and I'll explain why at the end. But it's Luke chapter 7, and I love this passage. It's not where most people will go when thinking about the issue of same-sex attraction, homosexuality, and transgender issues. But for me, it has everything to do with that topic. So Luke 7:36-50. And just to give you a really quick backdrop, I'm not going to be preaching on this the whole night. It's more of just like to set the stage. When you look at this passage, this is Luke, and he's an author in the Bible who's trying to communicate as best as he can the words in the life of Jesus so that it could change people's lives and really ground them in their faith. It's called the Gospel of Luke. And so Luke is telling us about an interaction about Jesus, and he's really setting the stage for Jesus being the one who's able to prove that he's God. And this is a really important thing for Luke. And he's doing this with a story, and he's contrasting this woman that I'm going to tell you more about and these religious leaders or Pharisees, and he kind of puts them on two sides of the extremes. So if we look at the passage, I'm just going to mention real quick here, verse 36. It says that one of the Pharisees asked him, which is Jesus, to eat with him. And he went into the Pharisee's house, and he took a place at the table. So Jesus, he goes into this Pharisee's house. Now, a Pharisee was a very powerful religious leader. They were known as being prideful and full of themselves. They were very powerful and influential, especially among the Jewish people. And they were able to do a lot of things. And so we wonder why. Why were they inviting Jesus over? But that really doesn't come up on why they had him there. Maybe it was to trap Jesus. Maybe it was to have questions. I'm not sure. But, and behold, there was a woman in the city who was a sinner. And then when she learned that that is Jesus, was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head, and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who or what sort of woman who is touching him, for she's a sinner. And Jesus answered to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And Simon is one of the Pharisees, and Jesus is speaking to him. And then Simon answers and says, say it. So again, we have this religious leader and then this woman, and she's a known sinner. Most people who study the Bible believe that what they mean by this is she's probably a prostitute. She's probably somebody who sells her body for sex. And we don't know how they could tell that by looking at her. Just maybe she was known in the town for this. But she was somebody that sold her body for sex and was known for that. And that's what most people generally agree throughout the centuries of people who read the Bible. And so she's really not going to be somebody that the religious leaders had any respect for or in any condition would want to be hanging out with somebody who was a prostitute. That for them would have been like the last person on earth that they would want to see themselves around and associate with. And so she's crying at Jesus' feet, and she's using her tears and this expensive perfume to dry off her feet. And we don't know why she's crying. She's just letting out her emotions. And what she's doing is very significant because it causes a scene. There's this moment where the Pharisees are like, if he's really who he says he was, why doesn't he know that this is a prostitute, a whore, that's touching him? And why isn't he stopping her? What a scene. How embarrassing. How dare he? And here's what's mind-blowing about it. Jesus then tells a story, and he basically says there's two people that owe money. One owes $50, another owes $500, and the word is denarii, which is money. One owes 50, the other owes 500, and they're both forgiven of what they're owed. Who appreciates it more? It's a no-brainer. They all say, well, of course, the one who's forgiven $500. And then he said, this is my favorite, Luke 7:47. I think of this because it's like an airplane. First he rebukes them. He says, you didn't give me a kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet, which is kind of an irony, because a woman who's known for kissing and sex and sexuality, she's known for being this quote-unquote sinner. She's kissing Jesus and his feet. And you didn't anoint my head with oil, which was the tradition at that time, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. So she took her hair, something that was precious, and this ointment that was very expensive, and she's wiping his feet with her hair. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who's been forgiven little loves little. And then Jesus says to her, your sins are forgiven. And then here's the reaction. Then those at the table with her began saying among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. So a couple quick applications, just a few things to think about, is that if you really get the message of Jesus, we all need forgiveness. And that's everybody. That's you, that's me, it's adults, that's kids. We all need forgiveness of sins. And some of us, if we were going to list out our sins, we'll have shorter lists by comparison with others. Some of you will have already as kids, and some of us as adults have very, very long lists of sins that we've done, offenses against God, times where we haven't trusted or obeyed him. And some of us are going to have shorter lists of sins if we could itemize them all, which I think is impossible. I think God could do that, but even if we tried. But here's what's interesting, is if we did list out all those sins, we all need forgiveness no matter what. However, our ability to love, it's a natural response from receiving a ton of forgiveness from Jesus. So if you're somebody who's decided in your heart, I want to follow Jesus, then your ability to love is based on this forgiveness concept. And what he's saying from this text is if you're a person who has a short list of sins that need forgiveness, it's probably true that your ability to love is going to be reduced. But those who have a longer list of sins, their ability to love is probably going to be greater. Now, he's not encouraging people indirectly to live a life of sin. He's really just pointing out, and this is what's really key about this point, he's really pointing out this issue that people who own their sin, who know that they're messed up, who in sexual ways or not, people who own it are far more likely to get the ideas of forgiveness and love. People who are self-righteous, who look down on others, people who think that they're greater because their sin list is longer, are going to have a harder time understanding forgiveness and therefore love. I wonder who you are in this room. I asked myself a question, if this story were to happen today, what if that person were in our terms today? Because nowadays, knowing who a prostitute is and isn't identifiable in our culture. Most of prostitution nowadays happens in privacy. But nowadays, the issue that we might say, especially in the conservative and evangelical circles, we would look at those who identify maybe as transgendered or flamboyantly gay. We might be able to obviously say, we think at least obviously, this person to us, we know that they're a sinner. But what if that person was a transgendered person or a flamboyantly, openly gay person who's at Jesus' feet? Who would you more identify with in that story if you were there? The known sinner at Jesus' feet, or the Pharisee who looks and says, doesn't he know? And oh, what scandal. And for me, I had to learn how to look at and see that I need God's grace. And I'm not transgendered. I'm not gay, and that for some people means I'm disqualified from speaking on these issues. But for me, to understand the idea that I need grace as much and probably more than anybody else in this room, especially if you're a known sinner in church culture. That I'm no better than anybody else, and I can't judge somebody else by their sins. I got to own my junk and bring that before God and recognize I need his forgiveness. I don't know where you guys are at. If you have sexual sins, if you have sexual questions, if you have friends that are here, or where you've gone, what you've done, and I don't need to know. It's none of my business. But wherever you're at, sexual issues have impacted your life, and especially nowadays in youth culture, the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, and the list could go on. That stuff is going to be impacting you now, and it will be more in the future. And especially if you call yourself a Christian or you have any affiliation with church life, this to me is such an important topic. Just a little bit real quick about myself. I'm from New York City. Back in the 80s and 90s, which for you was way before some of you were born, I used to wander. I had a train ride about 35 minutes into Manhattan. So I was born in Queens. I used to talk like one of those guys, and it wasn't a joke. I actually did sound like this for most of my life. And you might be thinking I'm joking now. Actually, I put on the accent when I preach. So you guys think I'm from Ohio, but I'm not. When I literally call my mother, my father, my brother, my sister, that's how I talk. I'm not kidding. You think I'm joking, I'm not. So I go to the Village with my friends, and in the Village, that's the birthplace of the gay rights movement. Going down to Washington Square Park, it's a special place for me. It's actually, I went to NYU, which is right there, and it's right near this place called the Stonewall Inn, which is where the riots happened, where the gays stepped up and said, this can't continue. The oppression by the police has to stop. Because we're gay, we cannot be harassed and beat up and attacked anymore. So growing up in New York City was interesting, though, because my parents became evangelical Baptists when I was a kid. And the church was very biblical and anti-anything sex-related outside of marriage. And they were especially anti-gay. The gays weren't really addressed much up front, but people's comments were that people who were gay were seen as dangerous, or they were equated with child molesters. And this wasn't good. This wasn't healthy, those parts of the church culture. But they were sincere people. They taught the Bible. They taught about getting saved and following Jesus. But there was a lot of cruel stuff going on. And for me, that really was devastating because I was a sensitive kid. Although I grew up in New York and talked like a tough guy, I wasn't a tough guy. I was a sensitive kid. And worse than that, when I was a kid, I was sexually abused by a neighbor. And it was somebody who was also under the age of 18. And that sexual abuse for me was a terrible experience. And because it was a person of the same gender, I thought that meant that I was gay. And so I became not homophobic at that point. I think I probably had some homophobic ideas, but I was afraid that I was gay. And for me, this was this terrifying thing that went on inside of me. And the church, when I would hear the pastor preaching, I thought he was preaching hellfire and condemnation, that I was equal to a child molester, and that I should be prosecuted by the law. And so I took on all these really anti-gay messages and I applied them to myself as if I was gay. And for me, that was a horrifying and humiliating and embarrassing experience. When I was in high school, I would never, ever, ever have talked to you guys about any of this stuff, the sexual abuse, the fear of being gay, or how I really felt about the way the church talked about homosexuality. For me, this was a huge issue, and really my mind and my heart got challenged on this because when I studied to be a pastor, the school that I went to also, there were some teachers that really became pretty fiercely homophobic, sometimes out front and sometimes behind closed doors. And that really bothered me, and I had to really wrestle through some of that. And so for me, after studying to be a pastor and moving to New York City again after I got married, I couldn't find a job as a pastor, and I started going for more education, and that's why I went to NYU to study social work. After I graduated, I actually worked in an HIV and AIDS clinic, and most of my clients were actually prostitutes and gay men that had HIV and AIDS. And so for me, counseling with people as a mental health therapist who was a Christian and trying to address the issue of HIV and AIDS was a mind-blowing experience, because that wasn't in a setting where I could talk about Jesus or what I believed about God, and most of the time it wouldn't have been good for me to do it. But anyway, what I needed to do in that setting was figure out a way how to help people deal with not only homosexuality, transgender issue, being sex workers, but deal with our HIV status and do it in a way that I believe Jesus wanted me to. And that made me have to rethink some of my ways of approaching stuff. I was asked some questions here, and I'm going to answer them briefly. And there's a lot of complexity to this stuff. And it's not things that, I'm answering it simply, but it's not really simple. There's so much more to it. And I like to use my mind and think about this stuff, but I really also want to be simple and direct. So please don't misread the stuff that I'm saying as like this is the end-all be-all to some of these questions. But here's some of the stuff that I was asked to answer in our presentation, and I'm just going to go through it, and hopefully this is stuff that maybe fits some of the questions that you're asking. What is same-sex attraction? SSA, or same-sex attraction, it typically refers to the internal side of homosexuality. And it's the broadest and the most ambiguous part when we're talking about being gay. Because same-sex attraction is more of the internal side. It's not usually referring to the external side, like the behavioral side of it. There's a research institute, it's the Williams Research Institute, it's a secular institution. In 2011, they said that there were 11% of Americans who experienced same-sex attraction. And it doesn't mean that they've acted on it, it just means that they had some desire or attraction for somebody of the same gender. There's a huge range that can go on in emotional and mental activity when it comes to same-sex attraction. For some people, it could be like a non-sexual friendship attraction where there's an interest, and a lot of people will joke in our culture about having like a man crush or a woman crush on somebody of the same gender. Like you're talking about, like I have a chef that I like to watch on TV. Michael Simon's awesome, and I'll be like, yeah, like my wife say, oh, you got a man crush on him, and we'll joke like that. So having a crush on somebody of the same gender that may or may not be specifically sexual, but there's this attraction towards them, that can be a part of same-sex attraction. Another can be where there's sexual attraction without any kind of disclosure or behavioral expression, like where you're attracted to somebody, you're gazing, you're daydreaming, you're fantasizing, you're thinking about somebody, and there's a sexual connotation to it. There might be an imaginary situation where you're flirting with somebody. Or same-sex attraction could be even more severe, where strong, powerful, where it's this lusting, this craving, this obsessing. It could be this powerful sexual drive or interest in having sex with somebody of the same gender. So on the one hand, you can have it be this very mild thing. On the other hand, it could be this very powerful driving sexual need, sexual desire. And so it's hard to say like a one-size-fits-all. And those are just 3 possible categories, and there's a million categories, especially when we're talking about the attraction side of things. The next question I was asked is how is this a sin, and how is it not different from homosexuality? And what I'd say is same-sex attraction, it actually can be a sin, as with any other form of lust. And again, we're highlighting homosexuality, but again, lust of any kind, heterosexual, homosexual lust, that absolutely can be a sin. It also, I would say, when we're talking about homosexuality, it has historically been viewed as Christians as a deviation from God's plan for human sexuality. So in other words, if you look at, as you heard in the sermon, I watched it from last week, that all throughout time and all throughout the world, Christians have historically believed that same-sex attraction is a sin and it deviates from what God's intended design and plan is for men and women. Now, when we get into this, there's some things, and I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill, and this is where some of the parents might later have an argument with me about this, but I don't believe that it's always a sin. And here's a few examples, and I want to be really clear on this, that same-sex attraction, it can be a passing thought or a desire that's a temptation, and temptation is not a sin, because if temptation were a sin, then Jesus was a sinner, because he was in all points tempted, yet without sin, is what the scriptures say. So people can be tempted. You can have a thought or a fleeting desire, and that doesn't mean that you've sinned. So temptation does not equal sin. The second is that same-sex attraction can be part of something that happens when you're asleep, like you're dreaming, and you have a gay dream. It's embarrassing if you identify as straight and you have this dream, and then you think, do I share that? Do I talk about it? It's very common, happens. And no, that doesn't mean you're gay, or that doesn't mean that you've sinned. Sometimes these things do happen. And also, I'd say it can happen as a result of a situation when there's gender confusion. Like, for example, if you're physically attracted to somebody who you don't know is transsexual. So you could be looking at a person, and as a person who's, say, typically into, as a male, I'm typically into females, and I look at somebody who looks gorgeous, and I think she's beautiful, and then I find out, oh, that's a guy. That's one of those surprising moments when you go, okay, now I'm uncomfortable. This is weird. But again, we wouldn't say that same-sex attraction, because the person is of the same gender, but they're transsexual, we wouldn't say that this is a sinful thing for you. So anyway, this stuff can get so complicated. I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill and talk about the exceptions of same-sex attraction and when it's not a sin, but I just want to make the point that, yes, there are times when it might not be a sin, but generally, historically, Christians have felt, yes, it is a sin. So how can the struggle that is with homosexuality, can it be healed? Can it be healed is the question. And really with that, I believe yes, in one sense, that healing of homosexual urges and desires can happen for some Christians, although that's not common. And I don't think it should be set up as the legalistic standard for people. That, in other words, that there are a lot of people that they struggle with homosexual desires, and those struggles don't go away. They follow Jesus, they become Christians, but they still have those desires, and they don't miraculously disappear. And I would just say that struggle is a part of the Christian life, whether it's related to sex or not, and total healing and victory from sin doesn't happen from anyone, for anyone, gay or not, this side of heaven. It's more common for people if they come to face that they're gay or they have homosexual desires, same-sex attraction, that in obedience to Christ, that a person will commit to celibacy, and then they abstain from the sex outside of marriage type behavior. That's more typical. I've met a number of people, I have a number of friends who would say, I have a lot of same-sex attraction, I want that, but I choose not to because that wouldn't please Jesus and I don't want to live that way. When we talk about homosexuality, and there's some shifting in language when we go from same-sex attraction to homosexuality, this is a little bit easier to define, and this is usually defined by an identity, a homosexual identity, which includes a person's orientation. But it's usually, it doesn't just mean behavior, but it can mean behavior. And again, depends on who you're talking to and what they mean. Usually when we talk about homosexual behavior, that's talking about how a person acts. And homosexual identity, which is what they think or how they believe, how they identify themselves. And I want to explore that for just a minute, because the Williams Institute says that about 8% of Americans have engaged in homosexual behavior in their lifetime. When we think about what it means to have a homosexual identity, it's considered to be about your core beliefs, like the core things that you tell yourself and what you believe about you. We all have scripts or beliefs that we've taken on, and those scripts and beliefs come from a lot of different things. Things that shape us would be like our culture, our society, the environment we're in. It could be our learning styles, it could be our biology, our values, our spirituality. But basically, our identity is about our personal life philosophy, and for a Christian, our theology of who am I and what do I really believe about me. I'm getting way complicated. I feel like I'm getting lost in my own head here. You know what? I just want to pause for a second and just keep it real for a second. I think there's a lot of us, me, you guys, that have confusion about who we really are. I talk to a lot of kids about this issue in my office, and some who identify as gay, some who identify as transgendered. And kids hear some mean crap, like just junk that you're told about yourself. And that stuff can last for a lifetime. I can still look back and think about some of the words that were spoken to me, some by Christians, some by people outside of the church. But some of that stuff it can really stick. And I just want to say for a moment, I've gotten technical. If you're a kid who's wondering about your sexual identity, or you've landed the plane and say, yeah, I'm gay or I'm trans, and you're here today, and it might be a few of you, maybe a lot of you, I don't know. I'm just A, so glad you're here. And B is don't let anything I say take you away from what God wants you to hear. I don't want to distract people with my views, my opinions, or my rambling ideas. I just want to keep it real and keep it loving and keep it straightforward because I believe the Jesus way, he offers a way of hope and life for everybody. And if you could see yourself the way God sees you, I think that's really what I and what the leaders of this church most want. It's not to take on what Christian culture says. It's not to take on what your school or your friends say or even your parents say, but if you could take on what God says about you, I think that would really change people's lives. Anyway, I just got real for a second. I'm going to come back to some of these ideas. You know, the way you look at yourself, we use language, words, and words are powerful. When we attach logic and meaning to our words, that's really what this is about. The way you define yourself, and defining our language is a really important concept in philosophy, in theology, and in life. And I could talk more about that, but I'm just going to leave that point alone. Does Christ say that what does Christ say about homosexuality, and is it a sin? Technically, Jesus does not directly address homosexuality, but that doesn't mean that he didn't think it was a sin. I do believe that Jesus thought and believed that homosexuality was a sin because that's the message of the Bible. A lot of people argue over this point. Paul and the Old Testament make very clear teachings that homosexuality is a sin. And there's a lot of arguments against this. I'd recommend checking out a guy's sermon that I watched. His name is Matt Chandler, and he did a sermon on YouTube at the Village Church on homosexuality, and he talks a lot about what the Bible says, and he takes a really long time in a good way to kind of give a biblical argument about homosexuality and sin. So check that out. But the key passages are usually used a lot by Christians and are greatly misunderstood by people, from Leviticus 18:22 and Romans 1:26 and 27, 1 Corinthians 6 verses 9 and 10, 1 Timothy 1 verses 9 and 10. And I'm not able to get into these texts and how to read them well and how to apply them properly, but there is a way to look at them, and there's some debates among Christians on how to interpret those texts, but I'm not going to go down that road right now. The next question I was asked is, can an actively gay person be a Christian? And we need to define our terms again. The idea of active, meaning a person, are we talking about their identity? Are we talking about their desires? Are we talking about behavior? And when we talk about a person who calls themselves gay, that to me is a challenging question, because I know a lot of Christians who have same-sex attraction, and they have had times when they've acted those out behaviorally, and I do believe they were still Christians when that happened, and I don't believe they didn't become Christians just because they behaved in those ways. It raises some really hard questions, and as a Christian, as a pastor, got to think about, is a person, once they get saved and they trust in Jesus, are they always saved after that? Or can a person lose their salvation if they've put their faith in Jesus and they behave in a certain way? Another question is, can a person claim an identity other than being a Christ follower and still be a Christian? There's just a lot of issues that come into that, and I'm not answering it in a simple way, but can an actively gay person be a Christian? In some ways, no. In some ways, yes. And I feel like I'm not being really clear on that. I feel like I'd have to tease that out at greater length. When you think about the issue of being transgendered, that's really the third main direction that I was asked to speak on. And this is really used as an umbrella term for many people and the way they experience a mismatch between their gender identity and their biological sex. Some of the findings from the Williams Institute says that an estimated 3.5% of adults in the United States identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and an estimated 3% of adults are transgendered. So I just want to make clear, when we're talking about homosexuality or transgender issues or bisexual issues, we're talking about what's called a sexual minority. It's not the bulk of people in our American society. And it's a very small but very powerful minority. And really, in the wars in our culture today, that minority has been at odds with the conservative Christian movement, largely at odds. And there's been a lot of battles between the gay rights movement and the evangelical movement. And you probably have heard and seen a lot about that. But I would just say briefly on that issue, there's been a lot of harm that's done by the church and by Christians. I've seen it, I've heard it, against the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer community. There's been a lot of damage that's been done. I've seen it happen, and I've also seen the backlash, the hate and the anger that comes back after that. I've seen organizations who hate Christians. I've been hated on before for being a Christian, for being a therapist who believes in Jesus and believes that homosexuality is a sin, yet does AIDS work and is a licensed mental health professional. And I've had that hatred, and it stinks to be labeled as homophobic or a gay hater. And that's the last thing I'd ever want. For me, that's been painful. But again, I don't want to own sins that I don't need to own. I just want to own and admit that Christians have done a lot of harm, and people more and more are doing harm against Christians for believing what they do about the Bible. Being transgendered, when we talk about that issue, it's really such a key point to this is that a transgendered person can be a Christian in the same way that a gay person can be a Christian. It's really important to understand that if a person puts their faith in Jesus, you don't have to fix your behavior to be a follower of Christ. You just have to follow Christ, and then the behavior that comes out of following Jesus, that's the key point. It's not behavior first and then faith. It's faith in Jesus, and then your behavior shows it. So when you think about this issue, some of the hardest people I found to love have been people who are transgendered, because I found that there was so much hurt and woundedness that if somebody genuinely cared, for me personally, just in my experiences with my transgendered clients, they've been beat up so badly, and especially by people that they're afraid of Christians. And for me, that's a travesty. That's one of the worst things. I wanna just transition and again just kind of talk about quick applications and admit something. There's some parents and some of you kids who disagree with some of the stuff I've said, and I'm not used to being up front and speaking to these questions in front of a group. I'm used to in counseling creating a safe place where people can talk about this stuff and what's going on in their lives. And I want to think about just some applications, some things to move towards. And I hope that you hear this stuff in the spirit in which I'm sharing it, that you don't let the controversies, or if you disagree with some of the stuff I've said, that you don't let that stuff distract you. Here's a couple things that I'm going to ask from you. The first is there's some 3x5 cards on your table, and some of them are going to be for questions for a discussion panel at the end, and I'll be a part of that. But the 3x5 cards that I handed out for tonight, I want to get some feedback if you got anything out of tonight. Don't put your name on it. Just something you learned. Anything. It could be, if you didn't learn anything, you can say, I learned nothing. I'm fine with that. And I'm also going to ask, too, that you can respond any way you want. You can say, Ryan, I hate you, you're a jerk. You could say, this was totally confusing, it made no sense. I disagreed. There's no wrong response. I'd like to look at those cards. After you write down, you could put a smiley face, an angry face, a sad face. Anything you want in those cards is a fine response. And that's for adults and kids. I'll read those. I'll think through those. I'll pray as I read them. And those will be not only kept confidential, but I'll be throwing them away. But I'm going to go over your results with Pastor Joe and Pastor Rick, because I want a chance to kind of hear where you're at, and I can't tell from standing up front here. So give some feedback about what you've heard so far from what I shared tonight. And again, I'm not looking for positive or negative. Just keep it real. That's all I'm asking. Another application point. You guys, you probably know kids or parents that are gay or transgendered or some other variation. I want to encourage you guys, be authentically kind. And even if you can, stick up for them when they're bullied. These kids, these parents get spoken to and mistreated frequently. And we got to stand up as Christians for people who are beat down. And I can't encourage you guys enough that if you hear and see somebody who's being attacked or they're using slurs, that you step in when you can, when you're able, and if you can't, get some help for them so that they're protected. And if you've labeled yourself as having a gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, or another identity that the church doesn't usually acknowledge or accept or recognize, or if you're not sure where you're at, don't deal with that issue alone. It's really important you find a safe place to talk about how you feel, what you're experiencing, and to find a safe adult to have that conversation. I know that this church wants to create that environment so that your volunteers and leaders are safe enough for you to have those conversations. So wherever you're at to have these questions, and we also, if you can, please talk to your parents about it, especially if they're safe for you to get into what you're feeling and what you're asking about your sexual identity. If you've ever been unfairly labeled as a homophobic Christian, would you please learn how to kindly and intelligently represent Jesus to people? There's a lot of great thinkers out there. This guy, Mark Yarhouse, is one of my favorites. There's a bunch of others. But to learn how to represent Jesus in a very smart way and in a biblical way and in a kind way, and to not be afraid, and if they hurt you with their words, get support. Again, find places where you can go to say, hey, I've been beat up because I'm a Christian, and I've been called a homophobe, because they don't have to mean the same things, obviously. But don't avoid. Some of you guys, this is an uncomfortable talk. I invited my son, he's in 8th grade at Brecksville, Broadview Heights, to come, and he's like, oh no, I'm not coming, Dad. You're talking about sex and homosexuality? No way. But don't avoid this issue. Ask questions and learn. Move towards God and godly people. Build an identity around who God says that you are according to the truth of the Bible. And then clarify the truths that you've been told, that we call them scripts. Weed out the half-truths and the lies that you've been told about yourself. And last but not least, guys, as Christians, let's be fearless in addressing bigotry and homophobia, and also not be afraid to address anti-Christian beliefs, because that's the world that we live in. So I want to thank you guys for having me up here. I appreciate the chance to talk on an uncomfortable topic, and I do want to close in prayer if I could.